Welcome to 10-6 Life Factors. We have Nobukhosi Ngwenya. That's the pronunciation I was provided. She is a doctoral researcher from Zimbabwe, but study in Cape Town, South Africa at the University of Cape Town. We're very interested in her studies, the thesis, Planning in Cape Town in Interstices, Case Studies of Informal Land Occupation in Cape Town, South Africa. We want her to kind of tell us, inform us, what does this really mean? What inspires her? And so welcome, and please introduce yourself to our audience.
Thank you so much for having me. It is truly an honor and a privilege. So as you said, I'm Nobukhosi Ngwenya, a postdoctoral research fellow here at the African Center for Cities, which is based at the University of Cape Town here in South Africa. So a lot of my work revolves around the housing question at the moment. So trying to understand how it is that individuals in government's absence access housing, which is a fundamental human right and a human need. And so in part of that kind of curiosity and in asking that question, that led me down to my, sorry, I think there's background noise, apologies for that. So that led me down to explore the question of land occupation. Because when you look at kind of the built fabric, not just in South Africa, but across the continent, you'll see a lot of informal housing. And often when you listen to media reports, when you listen to politicians, they'll kind of say, oh, they just sprang up overnight. And that also then really sparked another curiosity in me, because I said, surely you don't get hundreds of people coming to a piece of land or coming to a vacant building and occupying it literally overnight. There has to be a lot more organization involved. There has to be a lot more coordination. It can't just happen overnight.
Right.
And that's how I kind of landed with my topic for my thesis. And from there, it was not quite smooth sailing, but lots of learning.
Lots of learning. So yes, it sounds very enriching, actually. So before we get into the depth of, the producing actually this research, tell me about your journey from undergrad to graduate school to this doctoral program, and how did you decide on this university, and maybe the inspiration in terms of faculty support, or some of the other things that you mentioned that may not be so we know that the journey to PhD is not an easy one, so you could share that with us.
Yeah. So in my undergrad, which I also did at the University of Cape Town, I studied psychology and sociology, believe it or not.
Wow.
So I've come quite a long way from there. And I finished my undergrad and I went on and I did an honors and a master's in development studies. And truth be told, I struggled, first of all, to find a job with my development studies master's. It was one of those qualifications where I'd say, oh, I've got a master's in development studies, and folks would say, but what's that? Right. And then you have to
so
kind of...
we're going to ask you, what's that? Developmental study in terms of psychology? What is...
Yeah, so in terms of community and social development,
okay,
in terms of how to work together with communities to realize different projects, and what I realized was most of the projects that communities were interested in getting on the ground were infrastructure projects. So it's around, how do we get a road built? How do we get a school built? How do we get that hard infrastructure that makes life a little bit easier, or helps us or enables us to access and fulfill certain rights, like healthcare facilities, right? But what then, in the course of kind of engaging with communities, I realized that there was a little bit of a gap in my own knowledge. I actually didn't know. I knew how to work with community, I knew how to engage, but I didn't know how the infrastructure actually got onto the ground. Right. So then I went on and I enrolled in the Master of City and Regional Planning, also UCT. And it was there then that becoming an urban planner, I understood the planning process, And I got a better sense of how, particularly from the government's perspective, we plan for certain infrastructures, and how that infrastructure is then rolled out and provided to different communities across a city or across a region. And so, kind of equipped with that knowledge, I took a break from studying, and I went to work I was supposed to work at a private company, actually. And I always say fate had other plans for me. And I ended up working at an NGO called Slum Dwellers International. And there I worked very closely with women-led federations, women-led movements, who were intimately involved in not only saving so that they could contribute to part of the costs of different infrastructure projects, in some of them including housing projects, but there were also livelihoods projects. And so how working with these groups of organized women and these federations to plan for different types of projects, both infrastructure and livelihoods, and then bring them to fruition on the ground. And I think it was in that space and in that moment, in working with these amazing, amazing women, that I then that kind of sparked the idea around occupation, because also a lot of the work that we did with SDI was around informal settlement upgrading. And by informal settlement upgrading, I'm talking about where we have informal settlements, and then government takes the decision to formalize, and we go through a process from where we kind of put in the necessary supporting infrastructure, so roads, stormwater, sewage, and sanitation infrastructure, and then we go on to upgrade the actual houses and move them to more formal brick and mortar structures. And it was there, I guess, that where the curiosity was sparked, and kind of the question of then, but hang on, politicians say settlements kind of appear overnight, but hang on, I don't think that really is the case.
So let me ask you this question. You said that how did the funding come about for you for that nonprofit organization?
Yeah, so they're part of a secretariat, and the secretariat helps to raise co-financing for the different projects.
You mean through private, non-governmental organizations?
Yeah, so through private, but mostly philanthropic organizations.
Okay.
And yeah.
How big of an organization was it? The organization that
so SDI is quite large. Yeah, so it's affiliated, I think it was 50 countries or so the last time I checked, if not more. With the biggest, so not just across Africa, but also in Latin America, and India is also a huge federation that they support of women that they support there. So yeah, it's large.
And so when you said the gap, there was a gap in terms of your knowledge in using the academic experience that you gain, or the theoretical knowledge, then the practical aspect of it kind of throw you back, because you realize, well, it is not as easy as it may appear. So these informal settlements, was it within proximity to the University of Cape Town? How much of a distance was it? And the fact that you are from Zimbabwe, you're Zimbabwean, how were you received in these communities?
Yeah, so the settlements are about 20 Ks plus, actually they're more like 30 Ks plus from the University of Cape Town. But it's a 20-30 minute driving distance from campus.
Okay.
And I think, and I was well received. I mean, initially when I was now doing the research, and the sites that I used as my case study sites, I had never worked in before. So there was a little bit of hesitation initially, because they thought maybe I was law enforcement, and understandably so. But then when they realized that no, I was a student and I was here doing research, then I was warmly received. And the fact that I was Zimbabwean, actually it presented a learning opportunity, right? Because then engaging with the communities, many of whom were isiXhosa speaking and have isiXhosa heritage and culture, So because I speak in Ndebele, I can understand a little bit of isiXhosa, but I'm not like super fluent. And every now and again, a word would be said, or a couple of words would be said. What like, hey, sorry, but what does that mean? And then eventually they were like, but how do you not know this when you're Xhosa? And I was like, no, actually, I'm not Xhosa. I'm Ndebele. And then they're like, Ndebele from where? And I'm like, Ndebele from Zimbabwe. And they're like, oh, okay. But then it became a learning, like a teaching moment, right? Where it also empowered residents, because then they realized that they didn't only have an opportunity to teach me about their experiences and share their experiences with me, but they could also help me learn the language and teach me the language. And I think that quite leveled kind of the playing field quite nicely, or the research field quite nicely, and it helped to kind of disrupt that research participant dynamic that often gets in the way sometimes of getting really nuanced data from when you're in the field.
Were you the only one on this project, or were there other students or maybe professors or mentors in the field as well?
No, so for my PhD thesis, I was the only one. I was the
What
only
about the
one. But of
undergrad?
course, I had
I mean,
supervision.
I'm sorry, what
So
about the master's area?
So in the masters, I looked at a very different neighborhood for my research project at master's level. I looked at Woodstock and Salt River, which are more affluent neighborhoods.
Okay.
So the dynamics there were very different.
Okay. Okay. All right. So let me see if I understand this. You mentioned your master's degree in developmental studies.
Yes.
And so the experiences that you just share about the women in these informal settlements, was it related, and your work with the nonprofit, was it related to your master's developmental studies, or was it related more to the PhD?
It was related more to the master's development studies, but I'd also done a master's in planning, city and regional planning after the master's in development studies.
So you have two masters.
Yes, I have two masters.
Okay, well, that's great. So you have a master's in developmental studies and the other one in planning and
city and regional planning.
City and regional planning. And so, and where did that take you? Is it kind of just building on the foundation of what you've learned in the field, or is it like trying to maybe venture into a more broader area of research? Which is it?
So it absolutely built on the foundation of the development studies. In that it also then gave me a set of technical skills, because remember, the big gap that I felt with the development studies was I didn't have the technical know-how of how to actually plan an area, and then how to actually lobby it and get I didn't understand how we got infrastructure into the ground. And with a planning degree, I got that knowledge and I got that know-how. And so it absolutely built on that foundation. And I think it equipped me a lot more and made me a better kind of development practitioner once I was now working in the NGO space.
Okay, great. In that same, we're going to get to your PhD, but for some reason I want to kind of understand the road to that. In that space of meeting with settlers in those informal developments, and they're not trusting you because they think you're police. You may be a member of the police. Are you saying that these informal settlements are criminally profile, or there's a lot of governmental type of profiling that takes place for whatever reasons? Is that what's happening?
Yeah, so the key issue with a lot of informal settlements is that they are illegal, if I'm using the kind of correct terminology, because they've occupied usually government-owned land, but sometimes it's privately owned land without the landowner's permission. So that already puts them in tension and in friction with law enforcement. Who are often then called in to kind of serve eviction notices or counter spoliation notices to move people off that piece of land, because they have no right to be there. They have no right to occupy it. So folks residents are always kind of a little bit hesitant when new faces just pop up, because then you're kind of not sure whether, like, which side are you on. Are you coming to collect evidence and then hand it over to law enforcement and the landowner, or do you come in with genuine and good intentions?
How did you get past that to build that trust, build that rapport so they let you in? How did you do that?
So with the PhD, it did take time, and it was really kind of, here's my student card, here's kind of a little note that had like details about my research, and my supervisor's details. But it was going back, kind of, and engaging with folks, even before I asked any questions. It was spending time with people, literally hanging out, so that they could get to know me.
Okay.
Right. More than me getting to know them. It was about giving folks and creating that space and that opportunity for folks to know me, and to see that, yes, genuinely, I am here out of a curiosity and because I have this particular research interest.
Describe the families that lived in these settlements that you came across.
Yeah. Excuse me. So the families varied. So there were younger households who were just getting established. So you'd have a 20-something-year-old, kind of female or male, living, kind of just having moved out of home and establishing themselves. But you also had like still younger households and couples, who would have maybe one or two children. So also in their 30s or early 40s. Also just wanting to get a piece of a home, to build a home for their children and get a little more space, so that they kind of, parents can have their own room and children can also have their own room, and just have a little more living space. And then you did get a few kind of a more older residents who are in 60s, 70s, who maybe had been renting a plot or a shelter in a backyard somewhere, but because the rentals were increasing, were then forced to move and go into the settlement and into the occupation. So they varied quite a bit, but we see mostly more younger individuals as part of these occupations that I studied.
It appears as if they're employed, they are just trying to survive. They actually provide, labor to the surrounding communities or cities. So these are working people.
So quite a few of the residents were working, so particularly the younger ones, were employed, but many working in the central business district, so meaning they would have to wake up and commute to work. But many were employed, and just in need of an affordable place to live.
All right. So thank you for that kind of building on that. Now, I want you to just repeat in your thesis title again, because I think I butchered it in the first place. So can you tell us your thesis title so we can kind of keep going there?
Yeah. So it's Planning in Cape Town's Interstices, the cases of informal land occupations in Cape Town, South Africa.
Okay, good. So now you have all this experience, you have the knowledge, 2 master's level degree getting into this area, and you were able to establish trust. Did the PhD research, were the population similar to what you was it a different population for this research, for the PhD that you use for those in the MSW programs? Or tell us about that, the population.
So the population was relatively the same. It's just that the sites in which they lived were slightly different. So 2 of my cases were cases where the vacant land had been occupied. And then in the other 2 cases, it was actually cases of building occupation. So where empty government-owned buildings were occupied by residents. And those for me were quite interesting because until then, it wasn't a phenomenon that we'd really seen and experienced in Cape Town. It happened more in other cities like in South Africa, like Johannesburg and Durban, and where they're referred to as hijacked buildings. And it was quite a new and interesting thing for the Cape Town context. So I thought, let me actually include um, those cases in my research. But the population of the one building occupation is mostly colored, and or the term in South African kind of race discourse, colored.
Mhm.
And which contrasts with the residents in the other three occupations who are primarily Black, African, and isiXhosa speaking.
Mhm. And the number of cases you actually, is it the individual families that you became part of the case study, or is it the actual informal structure settlements that?
It was the yeah, it was the actual informal settlements that were my cases. So and in total I had 4.
Okay. And did you at any point did contrast, comparison, what did you find that you were, in order to make sense of what you were doing, you had to do that?
Yeah, so there was a lot of kind of comparing and contrasting as I went along, because I think it was quite interesting because particularly because it was the building occupation and the land occupation. So
Okay.
initially I was quite rather on the lookout for the differences. But over time I realized that, but hang on, it's not the actual site. The actual site, yes, it makes a difference in terms of how the micropolitics plays out and how the making of a home happens. But
Mhm.
in terms of the overall process of occupation, and in terms of the overall kind of processes and practices of sustaining kind of that claim to that space, there were a lot of similarities. And so my thesis actually delves quite deeply into the similarities and to understand the nuances of that process.
Share some of the nuances of that process. What did the actual occupants of those land, what did they have to do? Besides, I'm thinking maybe the landowners, the police, then trying to navigate, with the local constituencies to get a piece of paper to say it's okay, I can live here, or something of the sort. What were some of those?
So the first step really was to mobilize. And so contrary to kind of ideas that, hey, this happens overnight, I actually really found that there's a lot of mobilization that happens even before the occupation begins.
Hmm.
So perhaps the idea starts with maybe 2 or 3 individuals saying, oh, hang on, there's an empty building over there, there's an empty piece of land over there, nothing is really happening with it, it's been empty for quite some time. In many cases, and particularly in the case of the one piece of land in Khayelitsha, it actually poses a huge safety risk for folks, because criminals would hide in that space at night. It wasn't very level, so there were like places with shadows where criminals could hide. And folks said, "Hang on, we need to do something about this," and that something turned out to be an occupation. And so once the idea kind of sprouts that, hang on, we can actually occupy, then they mobilize the numbers and they have a series of meetings, all often unknown to government and unknown to law enforcement. They'll have a series of meetings as community members, to say, hang on, there's an opportunity, we can occupy this piece of land. How should we go about it? When should we do it? And then they agree on a date to say, okay, on this day, we'll put in, we'll come in and we'll bring our material and we'll put up the structures. In the case of the building occupations, it was a sense of, okay, how do we actually, because there was security around the buildings, it was okay, how do we kind of sneak onto the property, and then hold our ground for a few days and then say, oh yes, we've been here for a few days, and invite more people to come and join us and to support us.
Interesting.
It's
Can
yeah,
you
and that was
so state before we get into that, I want you to distinctively state the 4 areas that you looked at in
okay.
this is around Cape Town, yes?
Yes, it's around Cape Town. So
State
the one is
first one
yes,
is
so the first one is what is known, the official government name for the site is the Helen Bowden Nurses Home, which is in Greenpoint, very close to the iconic waterfront. But occupiers have now renamed it the Ahmed Kathrada House after a political activist, an anti-apartheid political activist. The second site is also in the inner city in Woodstock, and that site is formerly the Woodstock Hospital site, but occupiers, residents have renamed that the Sisi Gool House, also after another anti-apartheid icon, anti-apartheid activist icon. The third site is level 2. So level 2 has gone through a series of iterations because since 2017, residents have been trying unsuccessfully to occupy, and they've been getting moved off by law enforcement. But with the COVID pandemic in 2020, when we shifted into level 2 of the restrictions, they were able to occupy, hence the name level 2. And because at the time there was a moratorium on evictions, they actually used that to their favor, in their favor. And law enforcement couldn't evict them or kind of had the same immediate response. So then we have level 2. And then the fourth site is called Silvertown. So the case of Silvertown is a little bit different because part of the land had already been occupied. And so what I document in my thesis is kind of the occupation of the rest of that piece of land, whereby folks who many of whom had lived in backyard houses kind of adjacent to the occupation site, kind of thought, hang on, we've been waiting for houses, and other individuals have been coming for over the years to occupy this piece of land that's right next to us. And they're not getting moved off. So kind of why don't we, and I'm oversimplifying it, but we need houses as well. We need space as well. So why don't we mobilize and then occupy the space? So those would be my foresight. And yeah, so just to say that level 2 and Silvertown are in one of the oldest townships in Cape Town called Khayelitsha.
Interesting. So there's land occupation and there's building occupation. Which are the land, which ones are the
so the two in Khayelitsha, the level 2 and the Silvertown are land occupations.
And the other 2, Woodstock and the Greenpoint areas are buildings. It's interesting. So is there actually recognized leader in any of these communities, that because you talk about the mobilization and meetings and kind of strategy to get around security, especially if the land is being protected or the building is being protected. Do you observe, and did any of this, I mean, it sounds like you have so much to write about, even follow up after this initial dissertation. So any kind of leader kind of, came forward for you?
So in each of the occupation sites, the residents themselves elect a leadership structure. So they'll elect several leaders who they will kind of have to represent them, especially if there's kind of conversations with media that need to happen, or if they need to engage with various law enforcement officials.
Right.
And for the most part, it is quite a democratic process. But I mean, with any kind of representative structure, there are always kind of questions that you can ask and it's not always as democratic as it could be. But also the key issue with having a representative structure is that you can't have a truly representative structure and say that equally or well represented. And so that's where sometimes a few tensions creep in, because folks feel like their views are not being adequately represented, or could be better represented. But yes, there are leadership leaders that are elected, and it's always several, because that's one of the accountability mechanisms that the residents have. So that it's not just one person that goes to a meeting, but several people will go to a meeting, and you'll have several people report back, and we know that whatever's being reported back was what actually happened. Or if one person says something different, and then the others, then you say, but hang on, why are you telling us something different when everybody else said this? So it is also part of that accountability mechanism to have quite a several individuals as opposed to one very clear, distinct leader.
So you're saying they're having meetings. Is it clear like they have people taking minutes for the meeting? Is it clear that you're saying some maybe residents, occupiers, whatever the term, what do they call themselves, by the way?
They call themselves residents.
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 Go ahead.
Yeah, so the term, so some do use the term occupier, but most prefer the term resident, because the term occupier makes it seem that they're only in a space for a short period of time, and
Right.
that they are willing and can be moved on. So in calling themselves residents, folks are also kind of expressing that sense of belonging, and expressing their belonging not only to the country but to the land, and reestablishing that connection.
Interesting. So you mentioned in one, I think it was Greenpoint, where you said that, or is it Woodstock? You can tell me, where it was occupied by criminals, so they have to find a way in. Did they get the criminals out? Is that what you said? There were people, the buildings were being used by criminals or something of the sort, so they had to find a way around.
No. So the buildings just had security around them.
Mm-hmm.
And so the residents had to find a way in to kind of sneak into the building without the security spotting them. Otherwise, they would have been moved off before the occupation had taken root.
So is there any one of those buildings that were being used by to carry out criminal activities by other individuals?
No, not at that. No,
not at that point. In terms of transforming the buildings or even the land, what did you observe? Were you able to see? Clearly, you may have gone in the middle of the actual residency or when they occupy. So you may not have images of what the buildings or the land look like prior, unless you research it online to see if there's such an image. But do you see, what are the symbolic transformation that you see? Because clearly they're even renaming, and we're going to talk about that social political kind of framing. So tell us about that.
So, I mean, it's been such an amazing thing to witness, right? Because on the land occupations, you see the actual construction of housing. You see the care and the different kind of materials that residents are using to build their housing. A lot of it is quite temporary in nature, but that is related to the insecure nature of the tenure rights that they hold on that piece of land. But folks are taking the time to make their homes beautiful. And it's also like through access, kind of developing gardens, not just vegetable gardens, but also planting flowers. Some folks have grass, some folks have like table seating areas outside. And in the case of the building occupations, folks have repainted the interiors. I mean, it's amazing, bright colors, patterning, kind of murals. And each of the different sections has been renamed renamed according to kind of so a lot of the folks, particularly in the Woodstock occupation, lived in the surrounding neighborhood and were displaced from there, primarily by gentrification. And so what they've done to hold on to their connections to those places that they were displaced from is to rename each of the different sections according to the street names and the roads that they lived in previously. And it's beautiful. There's plants. They've got vegetable gardens. It's amazing. It's amazing. And there's a lot of repair that has happened to make, so it was a hospital building, so it wasn't kind of suited for residential use. So there's a lot of repair that's happened. Also reconnecting the building to municipal infrastructure pipelines like your water, your sewage, your electricity, but also a lot of retrofitting to make it more suited to a use as a home.
Yeah.
And yeah, and it's just been it's amazing to see. It's amazing to see, and a lot of love and attention has gone into it.
It is. It sounds like it should be one of those listed on a tourist site attraction, then if anything. So the fact that you're telling me they're kind of creating an infrastructure around these, that means they have to go to, say, for example, city halls. I don't know what they call it there, in order to get plumbing, water connected, electricity, or even phone lines and things like that. So how is it the government, or maybe it's private, that approving these things kind of, resigning themselves and say, okay, we're creating an account for someone who is occupying, we're trying to get off the land, but we still have to give it to them. Is it within a human rights framework, or is it more through capitalism?
So government has been adamant across all four sites that they do not support the occupations at all. And even when occupied residents were trying to negotiate to get access to service, government kind of said, no, we've actually, but in the case of the building occupations, they said, no, that those buildings are actually slated to be demolished because there's other developments that are going to go onto those pieces of land. So it actually would be a waste of money if in terms of the Municipal Finance Management Act, it would be considered wasteful expenditure. So we can't put in services into those buildings. So it was really residents drawing on their skills, individual skills. You have plumbers, you have carpenters, you have folks working in all sorts of different trades. Drawing on their skills, so pooling resources, pooling money to get the materials that are needed, but also pulling their skills together and connecting themselves back onto the grid. And even in the cases of the land occupations, it's residents themselves who they know they've got their neighbor who's an electrician or who's a plumber or who's worked in a building construction site. And they call on those individuals to help them get reconnected or connected to the grid. So it's absolutely not with government consent. And often when government whenever possible, government will try and come and disconnect. But residents often just reconnect themselves because those are some of the essential services that you actually can't live without. Yeah.
So you're saying basically that means they're not paying any bills then as it relates to utility, because they're not metered. There's no actual account or accountability in any way to say, this is the amount of water that you use, this is the amount of electricity that you used. So just, as you said, using their own skills to say, okay, you're not helping us, we're just going to take it. Is that what's happening?
So basically, yes. But what I actually do need to double check, because the residents have been there for a while. I should actually go back and double check if they are now getting municipal rates bills.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
But definitely initially, they were not being billed.
They were not being billed. Let me ask, so I'm gonna ask you about the lifestyle that you may, the distinctive lifestyle that you may see emerge. But let's talk about, was this theoretically driven in any way, or how did you approach your research with any hypothesis, any type of theory, driven data? Tell us about that.
Yeah. So it was a very theoretical driven. So I used a spatial planning lens,
Okay.
and I looked at planning theory, particularly theories around communicative and collaborative planning models. So this is the planning model whereby we say planning is a very collaborative effort, and it requires kind of getting stakeholders together around a table, and engaging in authentic dialogue until we reach a consensus on a way forward.
Mhm.
And the other kind of planning theory that I looked at was the radical insurgent planning model. So these are kind of bottom-up planning models, that say planning is a bottom-up activity, it's citizen-led, and we have citizens planning for themselves. So I used those as my two kind of planning lenses, because what I was curious about was the process. What I was curious about was, this is what I've read about in the literature, and is this how it actually happens,
Mhm.
right? Is it actually an act of radicalness or insurgency?
Or
Um, or insurgency, right?
Mhm.
Um, as the literature, because occupations are citizen led, and I was like, but is it really that radical? Because we have occupations every day,
Right.
right? Not just in South Africa, but across the continent. How radical is it when it's something that happens every day, right? How insurgent is it when it's something that we see daily?
Mhm.
So that was also part of my curiosity, now coming at it from a theoretical perspective. And also then I also engaged with the literature on participation, to say, well, is this a means to an end? So our occupations, if we consider them as a form of participatory planning, are they a means to an end, or are they an end in its is it an end in itself,
Mhm.
right? Um, and that's kind of the body of literature that I engaged with.
So if it's not insurgency or any radical type of approach, well, that's what the literature is saying. What did you find? Was it like a social justice, um, I don't know, means to an end type thing?
So I did find an element of kind of radicality,
Mhm.
within the approaches and the processes that residents have taken. And it's a radicality that's really rooted in a lot of inherited imaginations. So imaginations around what the good city should be,
Mhm.
um, and really, kind of imaginations about how we need to converse both with the past, with the present, and also with the future, because at the heart of it, there was also a lot of talk around the need for political conscientization, particularly of younger residents.
Mhm.
There was also kind of, when you unpack kind of the philosophical underpinnings and the philosophical currents
Mhm.
that inform a lot of kind of the discourse around occupation and around residents' role and participation in the occupations. You could really see that it wasn't just drawing on kind of your Western philosophical notions like your Marxisms and similar, that drive so what we would consider radical thought and
Right.
thinking in Western philosophy. They also really did draw on a lot of the modern African political thought and kind of African political thinking, um, and a lot of Pan-African kind of Pan-Africanism thinking. So, and also even works, the works of folks like Kwame Nkrumah as well would come into this, right? And you see a lot of this thinking that comes in through the very various slogans and catchphrases. And so it's and really around like an African nationalism and an African socialism that
So,
really it embeds the thinking and the work.
very, very interesting. I know social justice may be more Western type of theoretical lens to look through, but you mentioned gentrification, you mentioned displacement, and you mentioned just this need for us having a sense of belonging. And then the renaming of these buildings to identify where their political or social ideologies lie is clearly sending a political statement. Would you agree? And so
Yes.
if they're renaming the hospital, if they're remaining the other buildings that are there and the land and so on, they're actually in a way fighting for social justice because they have no choice. And the fact that you're saying that they're actually replicating the name of their street that they're being shoved from in order to build these expensive homes or high-rise buildings for people of different maybe a higher socioeconomic status that can afford these. It is a matter of social justice that is taking place, whether or not it may be seen as maybe this is the need for radicalism in order to send them a message. So the question is, let me ask you, are there any, because it sounds as if is the residents or this settlement area is becoming bigger and bigger, the fact that you have four. So is there political representation? Are they trying to get themselves being situated somewhere?
No. So what was quite interesting was across the settlements, excuse me, there was a very explicit kind of statement made by residents to say, yes, as an individual, you can have your political affiliation, but on the occupation side, you come as an individual, you come as a resident who is in need of a home, and you act from that positionality, not from your kind of your political background or your political home. And similarly in the two land occupations in Khayelitsha, there was also kind of an extension of that, was to say they actually didn't want any non-government organizations to come in and assist them with the occupation, because they were very kind of aware of the fact that a lot of the NGOs come in with the backing of their funders, whoever it may be, and those funders actually come in and drive the agendas within the NGO, and that could ultimately disrupt the overall agenda of getting a home that the occupiers were striving for. So it was very much about you kind of leave your political baggage at the door and you come into the occupation as an individual, and we collectivize, and we kind of come together around our common need for a home.
Okay. Do you find that the leadership, is it more dominated by male or female?
So it is quite dominated by men. And I think it comes back to kind of traditional, conventional gender norms, where women have the burden of care for just the home, firstly, generally, but also for children. And so you'll find that at times when a lot of the kind of community meetings were happening, women would be busy kind of prepping children for like with homework, making supper, and getting the children into bed for school the next day. So it is quite kind of the leadership structures are quite male kind of dominated, although in a lot of there was that awareness though that more women were needed to be within the leadership structures across all four sides. But it just never, particularly in the land occupation side, it just never really materialized that way.
Okay. In terms of the lifestyle, because for example, South Africa, they have different tribal distinctive culture. And is it the same thing as you would explain for the political, beliefs or partisan type of thing where you say, okay, leave it at the door? Do you find that there's different tribal representation in these settlements?
Because of the way that the Western Cape, which is we find that it's predominantly Black African isiXhosa speaking, or isiXhosa heritage residents primarily. And then the next segment would be the colored, I think it's I'm not sure what the split is between Afrikaans speaking and English speaking, but it would then be the colored race group. And so those would be kind of the two dominant in across the occupation sites. But in terms of other kind of tribes or ethnicities, they were not as well represented, or as noticeably represented as the isiXhosa and colored folks were.
If you could say that clearly, you're saying it, but because maybe because in your native tongue, did you say isiXhosa?
Yeah.
And the other one? And the other one is?
Colored. Is colored.
Colored. Okay. And so those were the two distinctive tribes that may be more visible in there. So kind of give us then, did you have to interact with how much interaction do you have with the formal systems to make sense of what was happening in the informal system, in this occupation? Did you try to kind of get a balance of information? Did you do interviews, or did more research, literature research? How did you go about that?
No, so I absolutely, and I still do interact with the formal system. Excuse me. So another part of kind of my work on another project that I'm working at is precisely looking at that interface between kind of the formal drivers of change within the human settlements fabric and the kind of informal bottom-up drivers of change within that fabric. So I absolutely engage and interact with the formal system almost daily. So I had interviews with government officials, so the mayoral committee member of human settlements, well, former now. I had interviews with him. I've had interviews with the owners of the land, of the one piece of land, so provincial government, who owned the Helen Bowden Nurses Home. I've had interviews also with spatial planners within the local government and other government officials. I regularly attend kind of workshops, symposiums, seminars hosted by government and various departments within government, as provided they relate to the human settlements in any way or other. So definitely, I've been engaging, and I continue to engage with the formal side and conduct interviews with various individuals across the three spheres of government.
Do the leaders or even residents in those occupations, do they try to attend these meetings just to keep abreast as to, what are they talking about us, and, so that they know if there's a plan to kind of just tear apart these buildings?
Yeah, so where possible, they do attend, but a lot of these meetings tend to be very closed door meetings, so by invitation only. And sadly, it's not often that communities get invited to come and sit in on these meetings. Well, first of all, get invited to sit in on the meetings, never mind getting invited to make representations or presentations on their own behalf. But where possible, and we if they know about the meetings and they can get to the meetings, they absolutely do attend.
So your research, again, I'm just going to remind, Planning in Cape Town Interstices, Case Studies of Informal Land Occupation in Cape Town, South Africa. You did mention where at some point, there have been informal settlements that are actually being formalized by the government.
Yes.
For these four point areas that you looked at, are there any plan in the work for formalization?
So no. The two building occupations though, that land has been earmarked for the development of social housing. So social housing is our rental housing, government subsidized rental housing for folks who earn from about I think it's 1,500 rand. So divide that by 17 would be just about $100 to 22. They've moved it up to about 22,000 rand. So that would be, and my maths is gone, is just over $1,000. So really we aimed, so government subsidized rental housing really aimed at kind of your working class and your kind of missing lower middle class, missing middle.
Yes.
And so those two sites have been earmarked for that. But most of the residents who are currently on the sites actually don't qualify for that housing option. And they will be so the kind of the back and forth in the conversation right now is to try and get residents off both pieces of land, both out of both buildings, so that the buildings can be demolished and then the new housing built.
And do they have plans to, is it simply displacing them into homelessness again, or they're having a plan to kind of relocate them for temporarily somewhere until they can find alternatives?
So for those who do qualify, there are plans to relocate folks. They say temporarily, but it's never temporary. It ends up being very permanent. But the options that the city of Cape Town in particular has offered in terms of the relocation sites are horrendous. I mean, it's sites that are 30 plus Ks outside of the inner city. It's the middle of nowhere. There's nothing else happening. And it's far from opportunity, far from the schools that many children attend. It's far from social amenities. It's far from economic opportunities, and even just getting back and forth from those sites to places where there are opportunities. It's expensive. But also it's quite difficult because there isn't much public transport going back and forth in that direction. But also I think over and above that, those sites really in only relocating certain households and not everybody, it causes a really huge disruption to people's social networks, which is also a big consideration, because even as neighbors, folks have come to know each other, and they've come to kind of help each other in times of acute distress. So for example, I know my neighbor, and if I need a cup of sugar or if things are really tough, I know I can go and have a meal there. But now with the proposed relocation, not everybody's being relocated, so it also disrupts that connection and that network of support that really is offered by living at, or that folks gain from living in the different occupation sites.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing that. In terms of the government plan to remove or to dislocate or relocate individuals from these settings and disrupting, as you said, just their overall social network, their economic opportunities, access, and so on. Into what percentage you believe of those four areas may be eligible for this housing program?
So I would say, I mean, I'd be surprised if it was even 50%. I would say maybe 30-40%.
Oh, wow.
It's actually quite a low number.
Yes, a low number. Where are you you're a researcher, And one of the things they say in the West is to be value neutral when it comes to your research. You simply go in with an objective approach and you collect your data, and you know, of course, driven by theories and other literature and so on. However, where are you where are your thoughts situated in this after completing this research? Where do you have an advocacy? Which side are you on? Is it a human rights issue? What is it in terms of how you can situate your thoughts?
I've always struggled with the idea of being objective and value neutral. I think I grew up in a household where we've always had quite a strong sense of right and wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And
So we were talking about your thoughts on it, and you're sharing why it may be difficult for you to take an objective stance. So if you could continue from that.
Yeah, so I mean, for me, it was very difficult, right? So what I did was kind of in my methodology chapter, I said up front, this is who I am, and this is the positionality that I'm thinking from and working from.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm filtering all the experiences in the field. I'm filtering even the theory that I've read is filtered through this embodied lens.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of owning that and running with it. I think one of the challenges, particularly as a researcher in the global South, it is quite challenging to kind of read a lot of kind of northern developed theories that say you must be objective and you must be kind of remove yourself from the research. There's no I in kind of academia. And whereas my experience kind of from my culture, from my spirituality, is about being embodied in the now, being embodied in the past, being embodied in the present and the future. And that interconnectedness with those that came before and those who will come after. And really, so it's an emotive motive. It's just filled with emotions. We have emotions for a reason. And I think when we try to shut them out, we miss out on a lot of life. We miss out on a lot of the nuance.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it's always interesting to say, but this is how I'm feeling in this particular moment about this particular thing. Why am I feeling that way? Is it because it's screaming at me because I'm seeing an injustice?
Mm-hmm.
Is it because I'm seeing someone hurting and naming that and labeling that? And I think it helps us ultimately be better humans, better individuals, and better researchers. Because if we are, how do we see injustice if it's from a very kind of cold, objective lens?
Mm-hmm.
Is it really an injustice if we're not moved by it? Or rather, is a textbook definition of injustice really the injustices that individuals are experiencing?
Mm-hmm.
Especially when the law says that what individuals are doing is unlawful. So there's also that tension. And so for me, I've opted to own kind of my positionality and own my emotions, and then feed that into the process.
Okay. In terms of the what were some of the questions that you may have to tackle with during your dissertation defense? What were some of the things that they asked?
So at UCT, well, until this year, so I was lucky or unlucky that they only started doing the defense this year. So at UCT for the PhD, but so my thesis was just examined by three examiners, one local based in at a South African institution, and then two based in international institutions. And then they gave feedback and said a few corrections, minor corrections or no corrections, and then that was it. So I didn't have to do a visa, but they are starting it now from this year. I think I would have been a ball of nerves, because I remember I had to defend my proposal though.
Yeah.
When I was starting the process, and that was nerve-wracking because when I was in the planning department, so most of the kind of the members of the defense committee were primarily from the engineering and built environment, mostly engineering, not so much built environment, which is the faculty I was in. And then I presented my thesis and I said, I'm looking at occupation, I'm understanding the process through a planning lens. And then they said, no, but that's a politics thing.
Wow.
And I said, no, actually, it's a planning issue. Because informality is here, we live with it, it's here to stay. But also it revolves around questions of land. And as planners, we deal with that question every single day. And unknown to me, also had really ridiculously good timing, because also shortly after there was a spike in land occupations across the country, with one of the leaders of one of the opposition parties called the Economic Freedom Fighters, Julius Malema, saying one day during a speech, if you see land, go out and occupy it. And although he's been credited with kind of inciting the bulk of the occupations that we've seen, I have my doubts about that, but it's possible that he did spur a couple of occupations. So my thesis was also perfectly timed in that sense, because then there was a spike in occupations. Everyone's like, oh, hang on, but actually, okay, we do need your research.
Good timing, yes. From your perspective, or even from others, maybe on the critical side, are these occupation sites eyesore, or they're, an attraction? What is it? What does it enhance the city, and maybe the intention for city planners to, create a more touristy type place, attract tourists? So if the occupation itself is not symbolic to what the city needs are, is it an eyesore, or are these just sites of attraction that, these people are really taking care of the environment? What does that mean?
So for many, simply because of the materiality of the housing structures, occupations are considered to be eyesores.
Okay.
And because they also don't follow that kind of modernist planning logic of being very orderly grids, with equally sized parcels of plots of land of urban than which each house is on. They seem to be chaotic. They seem to be disorderly. They're also kind of associated with crime and grime, in a lot of particularly the political rhetoric. And so for many folks, they would rather see the end of informal settlements. And even in the present day, we have certain politicians who will talk about eradicating informal settlements or eradicating slums, because they really don't see the vibrancy. They don't understand the logics upon which kind of the each settlement is planned. And yeah, so I guess the dominant kind of positioning is that no, informal settlements are things to be eradicated and done away with. I mean, there have been a few individuals who are making most of the opportunity, and establishing, like, we'll have township tours that might go through like a shebeen or a small restaurant or a sponsor shop within an informal settlement. but we don't see much of kind of the tourism, particularly the township tourism going into informal settlements per se.
Okay. Okay. What is it that you want to share? I mean, I know I asked a lot of questions, and is there any particular areas of your research that you want to share with us that I may not have, asked you about?
Wow, I would like to share everything. It's so difficult to pick one thing, but I think if one thing, it's to say, there is a logic, right? It may seem chaotic to us on the outside, but there is a logic. There is a carefully detailed process that residents followed, not only like in the lead up to the occupation, but also to sustain their claims to a piece of land. And I think it's also to say that let's not divorce um, the question of occupation from broader questions around land restoration and land reparations in the country. I think there is a tendency to sometimes think of occupations simply as, oh, it's a land invasion. Folks are taking land that isn't theirs. But when we contextualize the process, when we contextualize occupations, it really does speak to broader questions around belonging, around citizenship, around kind of the right to the city, but really around one's restoring, excuse me, restoring one's connection to the land of your forefathers. And so it's I think it's something that we cannot take lightly or just dismiss away very easily.
I appreciate you following up on the point about the logic, because it's if they don't see the logic in people wanting to find homes and creating more permanent kind of residences, being situated and having a sense of belonging, then I mean, I don't understand the position that these people are who are making these. Are the people who own these buildings and lands, are they in the which racial category are they placed in?
So all the land parcels under occupation, the cases that I've looked at, are government-owned land parcels. So it varies between local government owns the sites in Khayelitsha, and then provincial government owns the Greenpoint building occupation.
So it's not really an individual in any particular racial category.
No, it's government. It's government.
Well, thank you so much. Before we go, I want you to we're using the word which, interstices. And I'm saying you have a very long title, and also it's like we have to Google some of these terms. So describe what do you mean by that?
So simply for me, an interstice was a leftover piece of land.
Okay.
So it's land. It's land which so might have been built up or might have been left vacant, but as the city continued to grow, either the use that it was put to originally, it's no longer needed for that because the city has different needs and different demands, or for whatever one reason or another, kind of development skipped that particular piece of land and continued around it, but not on that. So it's really like a little pocket of undeveloped land, being surrounded by all this wonderful development.
Well, I thank you so much, Nobukhosi, for this very, very informative information that you provide, and the type of research. And I can see, so as you said, there's so many interesting pieces that I can see how many other research is going to come out of this. And hopefully you can even look at your own native country, Zimbabwe, and what is happening there with those small pockets of land, as you mentioned. But this is a trend, or maybe it's a movement, I would say, because in my native country, Jamaica, actually, this is something that we call it captured land, and they loose terms, and they call the individuals on their squatters. So it's stigmatized. It's even further stigmatized. It is not as planned. It is, it is so scattered and all over the place, basically, in terms of what they're trying to do. And the government is taking radical approaches against these areas. Even as recent as 2 weeks ago, there was an entire community of these occupied lands that was just, residents were completely displaced. The structure were torn down with bulldozers, and residents were pushed off. And the prime minister met with the families, but yet nothing. They have no plans for these. So this type of research is so needed, is necessary, and it should not just be dropped into a journal. You should have seminars and workshops. So I hope you're being invited to talk about your research all over the place. And I'm looking forward to read more of what you plan to write on this topic. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate you taking the time. It was lovely to talk to you.
Lovely as well. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.